morning to my honorable speaker, Professor Amrit Sen, my dear colleagues and students. On behalf of Katwa College, I welcome Professor Amrit Sen, Department of English, Vishwabharati, to our first online lecture series, and also grateful to you for accepting our invitation. I also thanks to Professor Anindya Bandyopadhyay, Head of the Department of English, and the joint conveners, Professor Durao Sarkar and Professor Indrani Ray, because they have organized this program in this pandemic situation. Under COVID-19 pandemic, we have gathered today in an online platform to present online lecture series on English literature. This is an alternative way at present to motivate our students and also to fulfill our organizational goal. We also look forward to more sessions offline when the pandemic situation is over. I also appeal to our students to follow our website under the head e-learning, which is very, very useful to you. I ensure that today's discussion will be profitable and fruitful for everyone present here. Thank you all. Thank you. Indrani.
Yes, sir.
Start.
Yes.
You start.
We will now begin with the lecture. Our guest speaker for today is Professor Amrit Sen, who is a professor at the Department of English at Vishwabharati University, Shantiniketan. An academician to passion and a prolific speaker, Professor Sen will speak on the state of nature and nature of the state, reading Leviathan vis-a-vis 18th century. Over to Professor Amrit Sen, sir.
Right. Can you, a very good morning to all of you. Can you see the presentation? Is it visible?
Yes, sir.
Visible. Yes, visible.
Right. First of all, let me thank Katwa College for inviting me, the principal, Dr. Sarkar, Indrani, of course, for inviting me to deliver this this online lecture. I haven't been to the college, but I do share a link with Katwa in the sense that my mother hails from Srikondo, which is adjacent to Katwa, therefore is an integral part of the district and the Vaishnavite culture that Katwa has. In fact, her ancestors were related with Mahaprabhu Sri Chaitanya's followers. So when Indrani invited me, I had no hesitation. And I would also like to suggest, I request Indrani to record this and upload it to YouTube so that, the entire purpose of these lectures are going to be sort of preparation of study materials for students, which I want to put up on my personal YouTube page so that, with the CBCS syllabus coming up, a lot of them are able to access this when they really need this at the fag end of the course when they appear for exams. It is with that, therefore, I am creating a series of PowerPoints which are text heavy so that, when students really need them, they can access the texts and the critical points. So, as Indrani pointed out, I've been speaking regularly, but with a goal, as it were, of creating this repository. And I'm very fortunate because a lot of my former students and present students have always provided the audience and provoked me with questions. And I would also like to thank people who are making these PowerPoints for me. I'm not a very good, technical hand, but there are, background people working in the background who sort of fine-tune these presentations. Another small word, I am suffering from a bout of sciatic pain today, so maybe after a certain point of time, I'll switch off the video and try and, make myself more comfortable so that I can take on this rather longish lecture. So it is with that introduction, really, that I start my presentation, which is titled The State of Nature and the Nature of the State, reading Leviathan vis-a-vis 18th century literature. Now, obviously, the state of nature and the nature of the state are fundamental to any discussions on political science, and Hobbes, being the progenitor of modern political science, as it were, carrying on from where Aristotle left, becomes a very important figure. But what I'm also trying to do is trying to alert students of English literature, specifically in the CBCS syllabus, to why Hobbes is important for literature. Right. In the history of ideas, the correlationship between the idea and the text is something which is fundamental and therefore extremely important for us who are reading these texts to alert the students to. Now, you can see obviously that there is a picture on the title slide, a picture to which I will go back to after a certain point of time once I've talked about Hobbes' text. Now, this is the picture of the man who we are talking about, and you take a look at the lifespan of this man. You can see that Hobbes starts his career within the Renaissance and leads on almost to the end of the century, as it were, just 20 years before the 18th century starts. And it's important to put Hobbes in his context, really. It's very important because this man, this is an older photograph, rather not a photograph, a painting, lived through some of the most tumultuous times of English history, the foremost of which was the English Civil War, and Hobbes was squarely within the context of this war, supporting the royalists and supporting the Catholic monarchy. Thereafter, he had to flee in a certain way to Paris. But prior to that, he acted as secretary to Lord Cavendish, so the Earl of Devonshire, in fact, one of the most important parts of what you could call the royal administration. After he came back from Paris, he actually made peace with Cromwell. He was tutor to Charles II in Paris, and very few people actually know that Hobbes was a consummate mathematician, a significant physicist. Now, this is important for us to remember, that Hobbes' political philosophy notwithstanding, Hobbes' contribution to science remains very important. He was an associate and a critic, in fact, of Descartes, and he discussed mathematics with Descartes. He knew Boyle, for example, and he was tinkering around with the ideas of Newtonian physics. Therefore, the material basis of Hobbes' philosophy, in a certain way, is closely related with his material interest in science. Now, once he came back after the restoration of monarchy, Hobbes was equally afraid because he had made a few comments which suggested that if the sovereign could not maintain peace, then he could be deposed. But Charles II actually sort of paid his Guru Dakshina, as it were, gave a pension to Hobbes. But then, in the fag end of his life, Hobbes was extremely afraid that his text, Leviathan, which was accused of being an atheist text, would lead to the punishment of him being called a heretic. And therefore, he burnt all his papers, and he was asked not to write anymore. I've already talked about Hobbes, the physicist, the material scientist, and his love for mechanics and optics. So, living through a tumultuous time, a royalist in his basic political inclinations, a materialist and scientist, mathematician for that matter, who interacted with some of the greatest minds of his age, Hobbes was a very formidable figure of the 17th century. Remember, he did not live till the 18th, but his importance to the 18th century, especially in literature, cannot be underestimated. Now, this is the introduction to Leviathan, where Hobbes actually talks about the Commonwealth. And you can see that Hobbes is comparing the Commonwealth to a physical, human, monstrous body. Now, this is very important. You see how Hobbes is bringing in a discourse of science and the body. And the body, remember, at this point of time is seen as the great machine, which is perfectly calibrated. Right. So, the Commonwealth, by extension, is an artificial man and therefore a perfect body, though of greater stature and strength than a natural. The sovereignty is an artificial soul, very important. Who is the sovereign? And the sovereign is the soul which controls the body, as it were. The point of putting in such an important section of the text being that I want you students to read the text in original rather than have derivative ideas. The sovereignty is therefore the artificial soul, the magistrates, artificial joints, rewards and punishment are the nerves, wealth and riches are the strength, the people's safety, its business, very important, the safety and the peace of the bodily peace of the inhabitants are its business. So the business of statecraft, as it were, of the Commonwealth is ultimately to maintain the health and the well-being of its citizens, most importantly, its peace. And then it talks about sedition, sickness, civil war. You see how important civil war is death for this Commonwealth. And lastly, the pacts and covenants. Please remember that Hobbes is, after all, the author of, as it were, the social contract. It is from Hobbes that the notion of the social contract actually comes to modern political science. So the pacts and covenants set together resemble the fiat or the let us make man pronounced by God in the creation. So ultimately, it's like Hobbes is combining a language of biology, mechanics, creation, and political science all into one to this great body of the Commonwealth. The Commonwealth is the concern of the Leviathan. And there you are with the introduction, which very few of us read. What does Hobbes want to do? Describe the nature of the artificial man. He says, the Commonwealth, that is, I will consider the artificer both, which is man. So human nature is the subject matter, which we are also going to probe. How and by what covenants it is made, right? So why does one make a covenant? What are the rights and just power and authority of a sovereign? Hobbes is going to also inquire what is the perfect nature of the state. What is a Christian commonwealth, the nature of religion within this commonwealth? And lastly, what is the kingdom of darkness? And again, this is also very interesting because, for Hobbes, ultimately darkness is related with the concept of collapse, anarchy, and civil war. So these are the 4 points that the Leviathan deals with. Now, Hobbes' state of nature is fundamentally a state of equality, right? And I'm going to just go into this in a moment, but we need to, get this very sorted, that a state of nature, this is book, chapter 13 of...
sorry to interrupt, could you be a little more loud, please? Thank you, sir.
Louder? Okay, yeah, right. Maybe my volume is a little down. So... is this better?
Yes, sir.
Right, thank you. So, the state of nature, the first precept that he will always make is that the state of nature is a state of equality, that all men are more or less equal. And the second is that the state of nature is a state of war. And why and how this war happens is what Hobbes is going to probe. And therefore, what is the nature of the state that emerges out of this situation of war? Now, these are quotations from the text. This is not something that I am making up. I am directly quoting the text so that students can read what Hobbes has to say. Hobbes' first point is the state of nature being equal. Men are so equal in the faculties of body and mind. So he says that, men are more or less, all of them are similar in body and mind. Of course, Dara Singh and I cannot be compared, but more or less, if you take an average, more or less all of us are equal. And there be one man sometimes manifestly stronger in body or of quicker mind than another. When all of this is reckoned together, when you take an average, the difference between man and man is not so considerable, right? So the weakest has the strength enough to kill the strongest. Now, you see, when you are too strong and somebody is too weak, then you can dominate. But if more or less everybody is equal, then there is the chance of a conflict, always the chance of a conflict. And Hobbes also points out the faculties of mind are also equal in human beings. I find a greater equality amongst men than that of strength. For prudence, he says, is but experience, which equal time equally bestows on all men. So knowledge, prudence is something which we gather over a period of time, and in this, Hobbes says, more or less all of us are equal. And therefore, Hobbes says, the state of nature, since men are equal, since resources are scarce or finite, therefore the state of nature is a state of conflict. And from this equality of ability ariseth equality of hope, he says, of attaining our ends. Two men desire the same thing, they nevertheless cannot both enjoy, they become enemies, and in their way to their end endeavor to destroy or subdue one another in the absence of any controlling force. Right? Therefore, what does one do? If you build up a piece of land and you till and you sow and you get a crop, somebody else is going to come and snatch it from you. And this goes on. And then he comes to the three causes of quarrel. Right? So why do men fight? So the state of nature is a state of conflict. And therefore, the state of nature is a state of equality. The state of nature is a state of quarrel. But why do we quarrel, asks Hobbes. Competition, diffidence, glory. The first maketh men invade for gain, he says. The second for safety. And the third for reputation. So then the first, you have to make yourself the master of others, because all of us are equal. Second is to defend them. And the third, for trifles, as a word, a smile, a different opinion. For glory, we fight amongst ourselves. And therefore, Hobbes says, we are in a state of war. And you see, Hobbes suggests that the state of war is not actually a state of battle, physical action. The state of war is perpetual unrest and insecurity. That is to say, that we are always afraid that someone else might come and take what is our due. That is the operative word. War of every man against every man. War consisteth not in battle only or in the act of fighting, wherein but the will to contend by battle is sufficiently known. So I might not fight against you, but I am always aggressive. I'm willing to fight for either glory or diffidence or competition. So we are always in a state of unrest. Society is always in a process of churning. Now, therefore, Hobbes says, man is, enemy to every man, because, and in such a condition, Hobbes says, there is only anarchy. Nobody will industriously create anything, because the fruit is uncertain. Somebody else might take away this fruit. No culture of the earth, no navigation, nor use of the commodities, no commodious building, no art, no letter, no society, which is worst of all, continual fear and danger of violent death. And then comes the punchline that Hobbes suggests: in the state of anarchy, life of man is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. My students will remember me articulating this line over and over and over again. It's not a very, flattering view of man, but Hobbes, as you can see, is suggesting that human existence is not a flattered state, it's a state of perpetual conflict. Therefore, what does one do? And then comes this question of morality. So where is the moral in this state of war? Hobbes says there's no moral at all, right? So nothing can be unjust. Notions of right and wrong, justice and injustice have there no place. Where there is no common power, there is no law. Where there is no law, no injustice. This is very interesting logic that he's providing. He says that, justice can be there only when there is a law. If there is no law, there's no justice. And when can there be a law? There can be a law when there is agreement and there's enforcement. Think about it a little deeply, dear students, because, Hobbes is asking us very fundamental questions about how we build a society. What are the bedrocks? What are the foundations through which social law is generated? And Hobbes suggests if there is no social law, if there's no criminal law involved and no criminal enforcement, then, or legal enforcement, then there is actually no society at all. There's only anarchy. And you have to perpetually remember that operating behind this anxiety within Hobbes is the Civil War, where this what you can call the state of fermentation, the state of anxiety was continuously present. So to understand Hobbes, you must remember the Civil War, where England was being taken, as it were, apart into anarchy. Right. Therefore, there's no morality at all within such a society. Now, you see how Hobbes is carefully, very carefully, divorcing, as it were, the political matter of the state from religion whatsoever. So when he's talking about morality, he's talking about political morality. He's not talking about moral sense in the Christian ethical term at all. In fact, you need to understand this. I did not put through because my slides were becoming too long. Hobbes says that we have to understand everything through sense. In a way, then, Hobbes is anticipating Locke. In a sense, is suggesting that all our experience is to be understood through the sense, and something which is beyond sense cannot really be perceived. So, in that sense of the term, Hobbes is one of the first empiricists of philosophy. And therefore, he says we must build a few laws. And these are what he calls the laws of nature, or the Lex Naturalis. And how does he define a Lex Naturalis? He says it's a precept or general rule found out by reason. You see, Hobbes says this happens, we are equal. We want glory. Therefore, this happens. Therefore, there is no morality. See, the causality, the chain of reason that is bringing. And it says, therefore, we need laws. Therefore, we will formulate laws. And those are the laws of nature. Right? And therefore, it says, what is the law? Determineth and bindeth to one of them. Obligation and liberty, which in one and the same matter are inconsistent. And then he gives us the primary law because of which we have the social contract. We are willing to give up some of our rights. Why? The primary law is that every man ought to endeavor peace as far as he has hope of obtaining it. We will enter into the social contract, we will formulate the laws for that one first and primary law we want to live. In that state of war, our lives were always uncertain. So in order to live, we must have the primary law of peace to defend. And the second, he says, the second lex naturalis, natural law, is by all means we can to defend ourselves. And therefore comes the most important concept in Hobbes. And this is the concept which will run through the Enlightenment, through Locke, through Rousseau, is the concept of the social contract. Right? A restraint upon themselves in which we see them live in the Commonwealth is the foresight of their own preservation. So that is why we enter into the social contract of having a more contented life, of getting themselves out from that miserable condition of war, and tie them by fear of punishment to the performance of their covenants. So ultimately, it all goes back to that state of nature of perpetual conflict, to escape from which this social contract becomes necessary. Now understand this. This is the major difference between Locke and Hobbes. Hobbes says we need the social contract so that we can escape from our miserable state of war. Locke says we enter into a social contract because we are naturally rational and benevolent. Two diametrically opposed views of the social contract. Those of you who are reading political science in your subsidiary subjects will obviously realize what I'm talking about. Now comes this idea, if therefore we have to have a law, there has to be an enforcer. And this enforcer is what Hobbes calls the sovereign. Now the question comes, what kind of enforcer do we want? Hobbes says that there can be three enforcers. There can be democracy, there can be a kind of a plutocracy, and there can be monarchy. Right? So he says a sovereign must be self-perpetuating, undivided, and ultimately absolute. Says the sovereign must be the one on whom we trust our rights, so that he becomes so powerful that he alone becomes the state. Right? The state is the sovereign. So Hobbes is one of the, what you can call, proponents of absolute power for the sovereign. And the sovereign is created by the compact, but is not party to it. It therefore cannot be got rid of because he's in breach of the compact. But only in one case can the sovereign be deposed, is if he cannot maintain the peace for which we have given him the contract. Now, what is the form of government that we need? Right? Hobbes is squarely in favor of the monarchy. Why? Because whosoever beareth the person or the people, or is one of the assembly that bears it, beareth his own natural person. And though he be careful in his politic person to procure the common interest, yet he is more or no less careful to procure the private good of himself, his family, kindred, and so on. For the passions of men are commonly more potent than their reason. Now in monarchy, the private interest is the same with the public. Right? So he says that the king is more suitable because his own interest lies in the interest of the people. He is the one common fountainhead of power. Therefore, you have Hobbes' vision of the absolute monarchy. And what are the rights of the sovereign? Sovereign has 12 principal rights. But the first and most important is that the subjects cannot change the form of government. That he exists because the majority has consented to his rule. Every subject is the author of the acts of the sovereign. So we have made the sovereign. And once we have made the sovereign, we must give him complete power. I authorize, that's the compact. I authorize and give up my right of governing myself to this man on this condition, that thou give up thy right to him and authorize all his actions in like manner. And therefore, the final thing that Hobbes is
Just
talking
a moment,
about...
sorry to interrupt you. Green Chili's Entertainment, whoever you are, please stop presenting. Yes. Yes, yes. Sorry, sir, please continue.
Right, thank you. Therefore, the sovereign is responsible for the maintenance of peace. So these are the remaining laws. These are the remaining rights of the sovereign, to establish laws, to choose counselors, to make peace, to be a judge, to prescribe the rules of civil law and property. And there's another very interesting thing that Hobbes makes, and this is why the church was so aghast against Hobbes. Hobbes rejected this concept of the...
So your slides have... can you come back to your... Do you want to share your slides?
Oh, it has stopped sharing?
Yes, yes, yes.
No, sir, you are sharing. I can see this.
Okay, there's some problem then. Let me once again come and start sharing. Maybe that will help us. Can you see my slides now?
Yes. You can...
Right, thank you. Right, thank you.
Yes, yes.
Thank you. Right. So, this is very interesting in the sense that Hobbes says that there can be no separation of powers between the church and the state, and the monarch. That the monarch will have absolute power also over the church. So, is explicitly also in favor of the censorship of the press. He says that the monarch cannot be criticized by the press and is against rights of free speech. And you see, this is where Hobbes has been seen as the forefather also of the ideology of fascism. Now, we will need to understand, of course, that, Hobbes is coming from a situation where the state of England is in a state of chaos, and therefore he is pervasively arguing for a centralization of power. But this is the great weakness of his political system, that it tends very heavily towards a system of fascism. Now, and that is why we need to understand why this text is called Leviathan, right? A Leviathan is the monster in the book of Job, and it comes from the two Hebrew words, lava, to couple, connect, or join, and into the shape of a serpent or a dragon. That is the tannin, right? So, lava and tannin to join into a monster, right? The creature was named using these root words because by his bigness, the Leviathan is monstrous, huge, because he seems not one single creature, but a coupling of diverse together. Diverse as in diverse, right? That's the old spelling, because his scales are closed or straightly compacted together. So it's a compact body and it's a monstrous body. It's joined by various bodies, right? And therefore, let us go to the figure once again. And you can see, if you magnify this, you see within that body, if you can see my mouse here, you will find that that there are numerous bodies which are looking inwards. So the Leviathan, or the state, is the figure of the state, is made of these compacted bodies who have given up their rights to formulate one huge body of the state. And you can see, of course, the power of the state in the sword here. You can see the cannon. You can see the different organs of the state, as it were, underneath it. Right, let me get back to the earlier slide. The giant crowned figure clutching a sword and a crosier, bearing a quote from the book of Job, non est potestas super terram que comparator ei. There's no power on earth to be compared to him. So Hobbes is the theorist, therefore, of the most potent and powerful form of the state, which trumps and triumphs over individual man. Remember this when you look at the figure of the Leviathan. Understanding the power of the state is key to understanding the power of the Hobbesian idea. Therefore, the state of nature is a state of misery. The nature of the state is all powerful to address this root cause of misery. Therefore, Hobbes is actually moving away from Aristotle. The figure with whom Hobbes is contrary is the figure of Aristotle. You see, Hobbes is moving from the concept of summum bonum to summum malum. Now, why summum bonum means the greatest good, right? Hobbes suggests that there is no greatest good. Humanity is always in a state of greatest evil and greatest anarchy. Therefore, the greatest good only comes when this evil or when this threat is nullified, and therefore a most powerful state is inscribed. Any political community that sought to provide the greatest good to its members would find itself driven by competing conceptions of that good. And therefore, the result, once again, we are coming back to this concept of the civil war. Therefore, no possibility of the greatest good of the greatest number. There's only competition and conflict. Therefore, there is only one solution, the absolute state. Right. So Hobbes's notion of the civitas, the state, as it were, is different or contrary to Aristotle. Aristotle suggested that human beings are naturally suited to life in a polis and they exercise the role of the citizen. Hobbes is turning this inside out. He says that human beings are naturally unsuited to any kind of civic political life. They are denigrate, they compete with each other, swayed by the rhetoric of ambitious men, and therefore they are ruled by their passions. They do not have the ability to prevail over competitors, and therefore no natural self-restraint, and therefore a state of perpetual war. It is this unflattering view of human existence, this nasty, solitary, poor, brutish, and short kind of human nature that the Enlightenment is going back to. Now, you see, it's very important to understand Hobbes's difference from religious nature of the fallen man. The fallen man is evil because he's fallen from grace, right? In Hobbes, man is naturally nasty. It's a secular vision of human life, of human fallenness, where there's nothing, it has nothing to do with religion or God or the Bible, as it were. And therefore, why is Hobbes so important for us? Now, why? After all, why should I linger on and on about Hobbes? Hobbes's importance lies not in his political philosophy, but also in the development of this anti-Aristotelian and thoroughly materialist concept of natural science. Right? This is point number one. Point number two, this concept of the social contract is the basis of all Enlightenment political science philosophers, Locke, Rousseau, Kant, whoever you are talking about. And also, this materialist bent of Hobbes is taking Enlightenment philosophy away into a secular zone where it is with Hobbes that the separation of political philosophy and religious theology, as it were, makes its mark. I would point out that Hobbes was at one point of time the secretary to Francis Bacon. And somewhere, I can see Bacon's ideas linger in the background. Now let me come to how Hobbes influences literary texts. So I've talked about Hobbes, I've talked about the state of nature and the nature of the state, I've talked about the importance of Hobbes, talked about his response to Aristotle, and talked about one human trait, and that is its nastiness, its competition, its selfishness, its greed, as it were, in a secular sense of the term. And this question of power that one must exercise. Now, some of you who have already interacted with me in certain ways must have wondered. I haven't had this question earlier, but let me ask this question to myself. Why haven't I included Milton? Because Milton and Hobbes enter into a very interesting dialogue, if you note this concept of power, what makes the greatest power great, and why is the Miltonian God and Miltonian Satan almost in a kind of a dialogue over the Hobbesian idea. I don't, because, primarily Paradise Lost is dealing with it from a Christian point of view. It would be very interesting to see how Hobbes interacts with these ideas. The interaction between Hobbes and religion is something which I'm leaving for another discussion sometime elsewhere. But the first text that I take up is Robinson Crusoe, which many of you will probably be studying for your CVCS, published 1790. I see, again, Robinson Crusoe is interesting because of this notion of the absolute sovereign over the island that he talks about. He says, I was lord of the whole manor. I might call myself king or empire. There were no rivals. I had no competitor, none to dispute sovereignty or command with me. Right. Now, that might seem very un-Hobbesian here because there's no conflict. But you see, we have to remember that Robinson Crusoe is, after all, in the island of Friday, in the island of what he calls the savages, in the island of the indigenous people. And this process of erasure, whereby he becomes the sole arbiter on the island, the one master who can mete out punishment to Friday and his ilk, is absolute. May I therefore point out how there is a causal link, as it were, between Hobbes and the concept of the absolute idea, absolute power of the colonial state. You see, as colonialism deepens, the colonial state becomes a Hobbesian state. You see, if you read your Rabindranath very carefully, Rabindranath talks about the rule of the law, the Choto Ingraj, as it were, the small Englishman who establishes his power, his ruthless power, over the concept of the welfare state. Right? And therefore, there is one branch of the Hobbesian which, as it were, enters into the colonial ideology. And that is where Robinson Crusoe becomes an early example of where Hobbes might, venture into in times of colonialism. And there's also this idea of, where, there is Crusoe's island is populated, where there's a captain of a shipwrecked ship and there's the mutineers. And you can see how Robinson Crusoe becomes the governor, the overarching authority over who holds these people in a thrall, who cannot be seen, but who is seen as the sole arbiter of these men's destiny. Now, that's a very careful way through which Crusoe presents himself. But it's once again very interesting that even when the island is dominated, or is populated rather, by Europeans, even there, the nature of the governor becomes a nature of a quasi-god who can completely dominate all other inhabitants of the island. It's not only a colonialism that we are talking about a ruthless power of a particular English colonialism, as it were. Now, those are very interesting Hobbesian moments within the text. Let me now come to the text, which is straight cut Hobbes. Gulliver's Travels, Book 4, the voyage to the Humanins, were the representation of Yahoo society. And this I've talked about at length in another lecture, but I'd just briefly remind you once again. In terms of bodily form too, the human is brutish, right? The Yahoos are brutish, shaped singular and deformed, thick hair, beards like goats. Upon the whole, so disagreeable an animal, or one against which I naturally conceived so strong an antipathy. Beastly in appearance, the Yahoo society, you remember, is perpetually within conflict. Even when the Yahoos have great food, adequate food, they fight amongst themselves. There is, of course, the mad desire for certain stones, and you have the concept of the leader of the pack, whose posterior is always to be linked and who is always in conflict with the subjects, marked by sycophancy and greed and desire. This is the Hobbesian society that we are talking about. Remember, why do men quarrel? The men quarrel because of glory, diffidence, and competition. So sycophancy, greed, and desire, appetite, and filth. So once again, the Hobbesian society is marked by more, this desire for continuous desire for more, and also, of course, the Yahoos are associated with a particular kind of melancholia, which I'm not going to go into here. And therefore comes the Swiftian idea of the Contemptus Mundi. The vast numbers of our people are compelled to seek by robbing, stealing, cheating, flattering, suborning, forswearing, scribbling, stargazing, every one of which terms I was at pains to make him understand. You see, Hobbes is the intellectual father in Gulliver's Travels. The human society is secular human society, which the Enlightenment suggested was one of great rationality. For Swift was essentially Hobbesian, one of marked conflict, marked greed, and marked anarchy. Now let me come to a 1749 text which many of you have studied with me, Tom Jones. Now this once again makes a very interesting pitch, because within the text there is a substantial discussion about what good human nature is like. Now, if you look at Tom's world, the world of Tom Jones, as it were, there is a variety of anarchic self-interests. For example, in Square, you have hypocrisy of the learned. In Thwackum, you have cruelty, violence, flogging, and so on. You have, of course, the greatest Hobbesian figure, Blifil, who uses hypocrisy to further his own ends. It's truly evil, the evil aspect of the Hobbesian dimension. You have Colonel Northerton and Colonel Fitzpatrick, who once again abide by their own self-interests. Northerton is almost on the verge of raping Jenny Jones, who's named Mrs. Waters at that point of time. Colonel Fitzpatrick, who is injured when Tom interacts with him. Lady Bellaston, for example, a woman who is marked by sexual desire. Lord Fellomer, once again, who uses his position to try and rape Sophia. So, once again, Fielding's world is also a world which is marked by anarchy, self-interest, conflict happening over and over again, which is offset. The opposite to this interest, self-interest, is the figure of Allworthy, the Christian benevolent, as it were, squire who embodies virtue. But remember one thing, that Allworthy seems to be strangely important within the world and is easily duped by Blifil. He easily throws out Tom from Paradise Hall. And therefore, there is this suggestion always within Tom Jones that a conventional Christian morality is insufficient to deal with a Hobbesian universe. Right. So Fielding's ruthless world, where wish-fulfilling ending, where Tom and Oliver, they come to a truce, and Tom becomes the inheritor of Paradise Hall. It's a wish-fulfilling ending, but it does not conceal the Hobbesian energies within society. So when you're looking at that text again, you need to understand that a lot of this anarchic self-interest, a society which is forever threatening to fall apart at the seams, which is held only by the wish fulfillment and by the dexterity of the narrator. And that is why I guess Fielding is at pains to point out how he is controlling the narrative, that life and art are so very different. Now I come to, probably after Swift, the most Hobbesian text of the 18th century, the Beggar's Opera. Once again, that's a picture of Hogarth. That's a painting by Hogarth, really, and you can see how the leading figures of Thwackum. The authority and of the jailer and of Peachum and Lockett. Peachum is the magistrate, Lockett is the jailer, both of whom are actually figures of hypocrisy and self-interest, who use the law and who use the political authority to continuously further their own needs. Now, at this point of time, you will, of course, remember that the Beggar's Opera is a satire against Walpole and his administration. Walpole, the prime minister, who was seen as the supreme Hobbesian figure of corruption and decay and self-interest and anarchy. Therefore, the entire body of these authors, Swift, Gay, Fielding, were writing and forming the Scriblerian Club, the Scriblerian satire, which was exposing the Hobbesian bias of contemporary society. Right? Self-interest is at the bottom of everything, as Brunson suggests, that everyone is motivated by self-interest, and Gay's achievement is to throw up an ironical alternative, the sentimental Shakespearean view of things that is within this figure of Polly, as it were. Remember that even Lucy, the figure who embodies her love for Macheath, is a Hobbesian figure who can turn against and scheme against Polly and threaten to poison and kill her. Of course, the great Hobbesian figure here is Macheath, the what you can call the outlaw, the highwayman, who embodies the criminal anarchic underbelly of society. But there is, of course, the concept that that the gentleman of the road, that is the highwayman, is imitating the ways of the gentleman. So you cannot make a distinction in Gay's world between the highwayman, who is a criminal, and Walpole, who is the gentleman. So all gentlemen, highwaymen, authority, jailer, magistrate, women are all embroiled in this Hobbesian anarchic world of self-interest and corruption. Right. So the lesson of this Beggar's Opera is that the world is all alike. Everyone is motivated by self-interest. Right. And that is the quote that I would like to talk about. Money is the true fuller's earth for reputations. There's not a spot or stain, but what it can take out. A rich rogue nowadays is fit company for any gentleman. And then comes this very important quotation, which I would like to point out to you. Such a similitude of manners in high and low life that it is difficult to determine whether the fine gentleman imitates the gentleman of the road, or the gentleman of the road imitates the fine gentleman. So the highwayman and the politician are all together in this Hobbesian universe. Now, These were some of the instances where you can see the Hobbesian worldview creeping into literature. There are two dimensions.
Amrita,
Yeah.
sorry for interrupting. In the previous slide, the last portion was not visible. Basically, that your name of the official website is. Yes, sir. Thank you.
Right. Okay. Have you? I will, of course. There's a YouTube version also, I think, coming up, so you can take a look more carefully. I'm skimming through the slides because I've spoken far too long. But when you take a look at this on YouTube, you will, of course, find the greater and finer details. Now, the Beggar's Opera is a text that I teach at the master's level in some detail. So once we are there again, we will talk about this in some more details, or we can talk about it a little later on also in the question and answer session. Now, let me come to what the responses to Hobbes were, because I've talked about how Hobbes enters into 18th century literature, and I'm arguing that Hobbes enters in two ways. One is that, there is the recognition that everything is material, that human beings are motivated only by self-interest, and that there is an anarchic vision within society. The second is this question about power and the state, the power of the state, and therefore, once again, its linkages with colonialism, which are far more subtle and deep. Right. So these are the two ways in which Hobbes enters into the literary aspect of the 18th century. Of course, the social contract is something that enters into the discourse of political science. Now, what are the responses to Hobbes, both politically and literally? The first is John Locke and the idea of the rational man. Hobbes is the antithesis. Locke is the antithesis of Hobbes, where Hobbes says human life is miserable. Locke says human beings are naturally rational. Therefore, they voluntarily give up rights, and so that there is a juster society. Hobbes says nonsense. Men give up only so that the state of war and misery can be put at rest. Then comes what we have not discussed: Shaftesbury, Hume, Adam Smith, and the idea of the sentimental man. The idea that men are naturally sentimental, benevolent, and moral, and therefore they are antithetical to the Hobbesian universe. This in turn spurs a whole literature of sentiment that is again anti-Hobbesian, because the literature of sentiment believes that men are naturally good and that they will suffer, but they will not indulge in self-interest. I don't know if any of my students here have read The Sentimental Journey with Me of Sterne or The Man of Sentiment by Henry Mackenzie. These are texts that once upon a time I used to teach. Lawrence Sterne's Tristram Shandy is, of course, a text that uses this trope. Then, of course, there's this response to Hobbes as a great atheist, blasphemer, as it were, because he's wholly materialist and wholly, he dismisses the concept of God. But please remember this, that I should not create any misunderstanding. Hobbes does not say God does not exist. Hobbes just says God is beyond my purview because I cannot understand him materially. Right? But the reputation of Hobbes has been that of a great atheist. Now, Hobbes, of course, has quite rightly been appropriated by fascists. In fact, the Nazis, of course, would come back to Hobbes as a kind of a forefather, as it were, in the absolute power of the state, in the absolute abrogation of human rights and the rights of a free press. In defense of Hobbes, we can only probably say that he was writing at a time of extraordinary conflict. Important to remember his context of the Civil War. To understand Hobbes, you have to understand the political context. And, of course, this is where his lasting contribution lies. The strictly material philosopher, progenitor of modern political science, thoroughly divested from religion, and leading to the idea of the social contract, and leading to the idea of a secular state where the exercise of power the nature of the state of nature and the nature of state is both extremely secular. You see, in my course, when I talk about the beginning of the Enlightenment, I talk about Hobbes. This, very, very debated philosopher who stifling rights, whereas the Enlightenment is liberating. But Hobbes is also liberating the science of politics from the straitjackets of religion. And it is in this, I would say, that Hobbes has a very fundamental role to play in the beginnings of the Enlightenment. Literally, once again, in the world of literature, the Hobbesian idea is carried forward in this vision of a selfish society. Now, of course, sentimental literature presents this society, but then provides an antidote. The world of the novel also provides this society, but then creates an antidote. Satire exposes this society, and then maybe creates a moral world. But in all of these worlds, you get back to a Hobbesian vision. And of course, there's this question of power. So whenever the Enlightenment text addresses this question of power and the nature of the state, you are willy-nilly going back to a debate which was started by this man called Thomas Hobbes. That is all I had to say for the moment. Thank you very much for giving me a patient hearing.
Thank you so much, sir. We come to the question answer session. We will take a few questions. So I think you have your student asking Partho Pratim Sarkar. Is he your student, sir?
Yes, he is.
Yes. So he asks, how much is the idea of state relevant, the idea of state of Hobbes in the present perspective of India?
Well, he's trying to ignite me into a political debate.
Yes.
Certainly. Well, not only in the state of India, but all across, we are moving towards a positively towards a state of Hobbes, in the way in which the rights of the press are being curtailed. In fact, the press is being controlled and purchased in a certain way. Once again, we are entering into a state of the power of this, where the power of the state, the nationalism, once again, is a discourse. I am interested in finding out from the listeners to understand how nationalism moves towards is a way in which the concept of the Hobbesian state is, as it were, reified. So we are, yes, of course, we are looking at a state which is closing its borders, which is enforcing a rigid system of law in various senses of the term. Remember, a Khap Panchayat is as Hobbesian as any other larger state. So yes, it is a fact that we are looking at not a state which is multi-dimensional or allowing a great many of opportunities for liberal dissent. We are looking at a state which is Hobbesian in that sense of the term, not only in India but all across the globe, I think.
Right. There is one more question from Borun Naha. So, is the Hobbesian anarchic society applicable to his time and the 18th century only? Is it not continued in the subsequent ages, especially in the 19th century, in its conflicts and dilemmas?
You see, once again, Bodum, thank you. Bodum is a peer, so I will take this question very seriously. In fact, Bodum, thank you. But I would say, you see, what happens after Hobbes is that you have Locke and you have Hume, you have the philosophers like Adam Smith, you have the theory of utility of the greater good of the greatest number, you have this notion of the welfare state, you have Karl Marx coming in. So throughout the 19th century, I would say that there are two ways in which British society is moving. One is moving away from Hobbes, beginning with Locke, moving away right till Disraeli, Marx, towards the notion of the welfare state and towards the notion of democracy. You see, this is the point. The 18th and the 19th century are the points where democracy is being established, the freedom of the press. Remember, Milton is writing Aeropagitica and so on and so forth. So that is being built. And that is the great Enlightenment society to which Rabindranath is referring when he's talking about Charles Freer Andrews and the notion of the Englishman. On the other hand, there is also a Hobbesian state which is progressing in the colonial state, where rules are being abrogated, where freedom of press is being dismissed. You will remember the Neil Dolpon being suppressed, and the ways in which the colonial state is progressively becoming more and more rigid and Hobbesian in that sense of the term. Of course, again, please remember that there is another branch of the communist state in Russia, which is again moving towards a different dimension of Hobbes, although in the garb of a welfare state, right? So it's very complicated in the way the Hobbesian idea progresses throughout history, but it definitely does culminate in the Nazi state or in the reign of Stalin, where you see centralization of power, where of course, the Politburo is the Commonwealth, as it were, in that state, and in Hitler is probably embodying this idea of the great Leviathan or the monstrous state. Remember, when Hitler is coming to power once again, Germany is in a state of anarchy and civil war. So, once again, you see, very interestingly, Hobbes has been a very strong presence throughout the political structure of world history. But my point being, that Hobbes is a thoroughly political Hobbes. But the 18th century literature is also taking a look at this aspect of self-interest and greed, which is secular rather than religious. You see, one of the things which we must recognize is that, throughout, prior to Hobbes, these are treated in terms of morality, in Christian morality. Hobbes takes them to a different level altogether in making them secular human impulses, as it were. Like, Hobbes says that it is the natural condition. So if Hobbes were to look at you with a microscope and say what kind of creature man is, he would probably look at him like in terms of how Swift actually looked at the yarn. Right. So yes, thank you for that question. I think I have probably traced various ways through which the Hobbesian idea progresses within history.
Thank you, sir. We have one more question from Shobhan Mojumdar. So can we interpret Montesquieu as an antithesis to Hobbes?
Yes. In a large way, yes. Once again, please remember that the French scheme of the Enlightenment is especially critical of the Hobbesian doctrine. Montesquieu, for example, of course, Rousseau would be another very, very important philosopher. Voltaire, for example, would be another major antithesis to Hobbes. In fact, where Voltaire makes this comment when he looks at English society and he takes a look at the rights of man. Why even, the French Enlightenment, even the English Enlightenment, when we talk about, say, Tom Paine, for example, when there is this entire idea of the rights of man being described. You see, that is where Bodum, the 18th century, the entire progress of philosophy in the 18th century, the American independence, of course, is seen as contra Hobbes. Hobbes is the philosopher that they like to dispute, right? And as Shobhan Babu has pointed out, that yes, Montesquieu is certainly in a way an antithesis to Hobbes in the way which is formulating the laws which are not designated to see men as naturally in a state of conflict, but laws which demarcate, as it were, individual freedom very clearly. So laws not to prohibit, but laws to ensure maximum freedom. If there are any political scientists here, that there are two versions of the law as prohibitive and the law as ensuring greater freedom to human beings. Montesquieu comes within that particular school and therefore certainly is an antithesis to Hobbes. Thank you for pointing that out.
Thank you, sir. So I can't see any more questions in the box. So if anybody would like to unmute and ask sir anything. Okay. Sir, as of now, okay, there's one more question in the YouTube chat. In some communist countries, how the government works can be related to the Hobbesian ideology, and also in history, we saw that many centralized government has a tendency to get corrupted. So this is a question from one of our students, Shogato Devnath.
Yes, true. But you remember that for Hobbes, you see, the sovereign has to be given power so that the sovereign can create, ensure peace and provide human beings with a certain degree of equality. So when the Hobbesian sovereign, so centralization of the state, absolute power to the monarch is something that Hobbes is articulating. The corruption of that idea is something that is taking place in the historical context. Now, one might argue, and the question there has a caveat really. It is arguing that whether corruption is inherently embodied within this idea of absolute monarchy. I am reminded of Orwell's Animal Farm, of course, where, all men are equal, but some men are more equal than others. And you have this concept as to whether actually absolute power leads to absolute corruption. Now, history has shown us that the Hobbesian doctrine is a doctrine which is riddled with tremendous pitfalls. So yes, not only in communist countries, in countries across South America, for example, there have been regimes which have been extremely violent, extremely, prohibitive. Think about, a country which calls itself communist, but in reality professes a variety of capitalism, which is equally Hobbesian, and that is China. So the Hobbesian idea permeates it. Yes, there are certain parallels, but once again, you see, these are political ideas. The way you put them into praxis is what marks what kind of state you have in society. Hobbes says, I say this because of a state of nature. Therefore, the nature of the state must be like this. The root of the communist state is a different root. The communist state does not talk about that kind of a state of nature. This we will have to understand.
Mudurima Ghosh says, I don't know why, but what happens is that whenever I try to imagine the figure of Leviathan, I end up seeing the map of nation, which has been envisioned with political ideologies as Bharat Mata during the struggle for independence. Would you like to share your views?
Mudurima, I would probably not agree with that. The Bharat Mata, when you take a look at that figure, you will find that, you see, even Rabindranath uses this concept of the nation as mother in a very different way, as somebody who's tattered and torn and extremely, impoverished, as it were. Therefore, it is a victim figure, but who inspires. Now, this vision of this muscular nationalism, where the Bharat Mata is a global geopolitical and religious figure is something which is a slighter derivative, which is a derivative of that idea presented in a slightly different era. So you see, the Bharat Mata image is something which is not uniform across colonial history or the history of our nation. So the way in which Bharat Mata is being portrayed, say in 1905, would not be the way in which it is being presented after, say, 1990. So we will have to make these finer distinctions here. I would not probably link, that idea, but I do, if there's one image of Hobbes which comes to my mind, it's, the swaying of the Nazi flags and the swastika. That would be probably a more apt way in which Hobbes would be imagined. But then again, Hobbes was not a Nazi in that sense of the term. He was merely responding to a moment in history.
I can't see any more questions, sir. So, thank you so much. If anyone wants to, Devottama says the movement of Hobbes towards a secularist and in fact materialistic state, can we think of this shift guided by the need to get out of the corruption that permeated religion and move the rights of the church property and establish the control of property rights to the monarch, since Hobbes always remains partial to authoritarian monarchy?
Well, to a certain extent, it's not merely the corruption of the church actually that he's talking about. You see, what was happening is that, the deeper divisions in society which were generated by the church and which sort of fed into this concept of the civil war were definitely responsible. And, Hobbes is taking a look at whether this division of power between the secular and the religious organizations of state does any benefit to society. Hobbes saw no benefit at all, and he said that there can be only one source of authority, and that will be the state. So religion was largely a private matter in that sense of the term. Having said that, Devottama, Hobbes's approach to religion is slightly, I think, more complex than what we credit him for. But again, that is something which we will have to understand only and only when we read Hobbes, especially Leviathan, in slightly greater detail. This concept of the Christian commonwealth is something which you need to understand. Hobbes is providing once again with a caveat in the sense that the Christian commonwealth is slightly a more humane commonwealth, but Hobbes saw it as something which was largely unattainable, as it were.
Thank you so much, sir. So I think it's been a long session for you, and you are not very well, sir. So would you like to close here? Shall we?
Well, I have weathered the storm. If there are any other questions, I'd be glad to answer.
Okay.
But if there are no more questions, no problems. We can end this session.
I can't see neither of the chat box, so in that case, maybe we shall have to call it a day.
Right.
Guru Naha, I think, wants to just add one thing. That is the final part of my earlier question, and in this regard is the Hobbesian solution of the absolute power, or his idea of social contract, applicable to solve the anarchy of the 19th century?
Well, I'm not exactly sure what you mean by the anarchy of the 19th century. Would you like to specify, Bonum, if you are there? Why don't you actually specify what you mean by the anarchy of the 19th century? I saw you somewhere. Are you there, Bonum?
Please unmute and speak.
Yes, sir. Hello, am I audible?
Yes, you are audible.
Sir, I'm actually, by anarchy, I'm actually referring to the religious conflicts and all the other social dilemmas that were existent in 19th century. Which is why
I wouldn't say they were anarchic in that sense of the term. The real sense of flux comes in probably when Darwin comes in and takes the hammer to the idea of religion, as it were. So in that sense, but then for that, it's a kind of intellectual crisis that society is thrown into. You see, therefore, I don't think the Hobbesian concept of anarchy, of actual social and more political anarchy, applies very much to the 19th century. We are talking about two different notions of anarchy, I guess. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. So there are no more questions.
Right. Thank you then for attending and providing this platform for sharing this. Do please remember to send me the YouTube link so that I can disseminate it more widely among my students. And thank you, peers and students, for attending this. I hope my students who will go into the next semester to read in Leviathan will take something from this lecture and will meet and discuss Hobbes later on. For anybody else, please do write to me at my email address. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, sir. I hope our students benefit too, and we look forward to more sessions with you because you make things very easy and very approachable for us. So we also get inspired to teach our students accordingly. Thank you so much, and we hope to meet you soon.
Right. Thank you very much.
Thank you everyone for joining. We shall now end the meeting.